Hello, everyone, and welcome to Breakout Parallel Session 5A on Climate Neutral Farming Systems, which is part of the Breakout Parallel Sessions on farming's contribution to the Fit for 55 package. My name is Dave Keating. I'm a journalist based in Brussels following energy, agriculture, and climate issues, and I'm going to be guiding us through this parallel session, which of course comes at a time when the Fit for 55 package is one of the big animating legislative forces here in Brussels. The package came out in July. It's a package with lots of different initiatives, and they affect basically every area of our lives. So right now we're going to be talking about how agriculture mixes in with those goals and how climate neutral farming systems can contribute to the overall goals of the European Union. Now, you guys are going to be able to ask your questions to the panelists, who I'm going to introduce to you shortly. You'll be able to do that using Slido. So you're going to want to use the Slido hashtag AGRI Outlook, and then select this workshop, which is 5A, and then you'll be able to write your questions in there, and I can ask them to the panelists. So put in your burning questions about climate neutral farming systems there, and I'll be happy to have those questions answered for you. Right, so let's dive in. We're first going to get a scene setting from Alan Bellward. He's head of unit at the European Commission for the Joint Research Center, which is the European Commission's science and knowledge service, which employs scientists to carry out research in order to provide independent scientific advice and support EU policy. It's the body that basically advises the Commission before they put forward legislative proposals. So Alan, I turn it over to you now to set the scene.
Thank you very much. Do we have slides, or am I going without them? Okay, I'll go without them. All right. I can assure you there were some beautiful slides, but we'll go in a non-visual, purely audio version.
I think we have the slides coming, Alan, so they should be here in a second.
Okay.
I see them, at least. I don't know if the audience... Does the audience see the slides?
The presenter doesn't see them. Don't worry.
Well, I see. It does look lovely. I see. I have it here in front of me. There they are.
Oh, yeah. There's some beautiful slides out there. Yeah.
Do you see them now, Alan?
Yeah. Yes, I do.
Great.
I do.
Okay.
Thank you. So what I was asked to do was to set the scene around the importance of climate adaptation. And my colleagues and I at the JRC wanted to share a few ideas with you. And the first one is, we're all aware of adaptation in terms of climate extremes, droughts and floods and heat waves and sudden frosts and high winds and things. But we also want to bring your attention to the need in the climate neutral Fit for 55 package of adaptation to a slower process. And you can have non-extreme climates if those climatic effects occur in the wrong place at the wrong time. They can be just as devastating as that sudden storm or that sudden cold spell. So that's the first point we want to make, is that adaptation is not just about climate extremes. So next slide, please. The next point we want to make is that adaptation, and indeed the whole climate story, cannot be held in isolation from all of the CAP objectives. Everything is interconnected. What we do in terms of climate change adaptation cannot be at the expense of production or livelihoods or biodiversity or any of the other CAP objectives. So there's that interconnectedness between climate and the other CAP objectives. And the next slide, please. Do we need to act? Is climate change adaptation really an issue in the agricultural sector? According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in its 2019 special report on climate change and land, the answer is an overwhelming yes. I don't suppose you can see the detail on that slide, but effectively you move from white, which is pretty much nothing's going to change, through to purple, in which, hang on, everything's going to change. And the list of challenges could be everything from increased fires to reduced yields to reduced production. The significant thing about that diagram there is that you're already hitting yellows and oranges by the time you get to a 1 degree warming. And we've all got the resonances of the last Conference of the Parties to the Climate Change Convention in our minds. So that is a pretty much on the cards thing. The next thing that's really vital in that diagram is the little H's on the side, which means that there's a very high confidence that that change will occur. So yes, things are going to happen. Next slide, please. Things are already happening. What we are finding is a gradual shift northwards and a little bit east in terms of agroclimatic zones, where the temperatures are right for growing which crop. There's a shift of about maybe 50, maybe 100, 150 kilometers every decade. That's observed, that's not modeled. If you translate that into the model output, and what this diagram is showing is where the consequences of that may be felt as we move forward towards 2030 and then on to 2060. So within the period that we're talking about for the Fit for 55. And what you see there is shifts in the areas where durum wheat production will stop occurring and where it will then move into new zones. So it will have a most significant impact. Next slide, please. Next thing that we're interested in is not just what you can grow, but how much of it you can grow. And what this diagram shows in the red line is the trend in wheat production. It doesn't matter where, it's somewhere in the European Union. I won't go into details of where it is, but there's a general increase because we've got better at farming, we've got better at agricultural practices, yields are going up. The blue line shows the more variability, largely due to weather and weather events. And you can normalize the whole thing to get rid of the trend and just look at the variability. And at the JRC, we're working on turning that into a climate change resilience indicator. And the bottom graph shows you that according to these calculations, resilience is already dropping. So we need to act, and we need to act now. Next slide, please. How are we going to act? Well, the very first thing that we feel is sharing information. What are the best practices? What are the consequences? Getting that information out there. So that's the first thing that we're doing. And we've created a wiki, and the details are on the screen there. And it's about putting that information into the hands of the people that need it immediately. And the next slide, please. The next thing we're doing is trying to harness a little bit of the digitalization agenda. This is to illustrate that it's really about communication and measurement and observation. It's all the different dimensions of the digital field. Next slide, please. If we start with the observation side, a few years ago, and I was certainly guilty of this, we tended to oversell the capacity of satellites as an observing system. You can't do that now. There are so many up there producing an absolute deluge of data, and we've got so good at turning it into information using artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning, that we're able to pick up very small shifts in agricultural calendar, in agricultural practices. And so that sort of information flow can be adapted to gaining information about what is actually happening, not just on a sort of general sense, but down to an individual field level of activity. Next slide, please. And the other part of the digital agenda that we're working on is your smartphone, not just in terms of its communication capability, but taking geotagged photography and what we can do with that, about turning that into information related to climate adaptation, to climate change mitigation in terms of practices, in terms of what's actually happening in a field at a location that you know at a certain time. And then my last slide, please. So we think there are three messages as the sort of scene setter for this. The first one is that adaptation and mitigation are intertwined. You can have one without the other, but there's much more power when you bring the two together. When you're talking about adaptation and climate change adaptation, it marches to a slightly different rhythm to mitigation. Let's take something like soil carbon. We know that as a mitigation strategy, increasing soil carbon uptake is a great idea. If you do something tomorrow you'll start to feel the effects in a few years' time, maybe 10 years, maybe 20 years, maybe 30 years. But as I tried to show in the first few slides, we need to act in terms of adaptation now. Things are already changing. So it's operating at a different time scale. And then the third message is, as we said, there is no silver bullet for climate and climate change adaptation and mitigation. It's got to be addressed along with all the other CAP priorities as a connected whole. And there are huge trade-offs. There are huge win-win solutions if we get it right. So if we get something like soil carbon increase right, and it's managed properly, you will not just get a richer soil carbon in terms of climate, you'll also increase soil biodiversity. So it's that sort of win-win. So overall, adaptation and mitigation intertwined. We need to act now for adaptation, and we've got to get the coherence. And if we get that right, then maybe we will have an agriculture fit for those young farmers that one of the other CAP objectives wants to attract into the business. So I think that'll do me for setting the scene in a few minutes, and I'll hand back over to you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
I think what's particularly interesting there about your presentation is just the rate of change we're seeing. I mean, that map with the northward shift of climate patterns, I think, really hammers home your point, your recommendation there at the end, that adaptation and mitigation needs to move to a faster timetable. So stick around with us. We're going to bring you back into the discussion in a couple of minutes. And of course, if you guys at home have a question for Alan, just write it into Slido and I will ask it to him for you. So now we're going to hear about a couple initiatives on climate neutrality. I would like to introduce next Doris Letina, a farmer and vice president at the European Council of Young Farmers. Doris?
Thank you very much. I will wait a bit if there are also slides behind my presentation, but if not, I will start talking. So climate neutrality is certainly part of the future, but the road to it, as you've heard, it's not self-evident. It's also not easy and not most affordable. However, we can probably all agree that we are on this path together. So I come from Slovenia, where we have a family farm. Our main activity is apple growing, but we also have plums, grapes, walnuts, chestnuts, some forestry, meadows, arable land, pretty diverse farm. And the farm has always been aware of the importance of biodiversity and environmental acceptability. And today, I will present just a few steps to take towards climate neutrality. We are certainly not close yet, but I'm sure that every step counts. We can go to the next slide, please. It all starts with the first step, in which is included risk management and decent prices. So we can even start following this path. It was already mentioned by Alan. So adoption of climate change and resilience, you see on a picture, hail protection system and irrigation system that enable us to produce a quality crop for which it's important that it's properly paid. So we can continue walking along the set path. Spring frost, then summer droughts, and the possibility of the hail in almost all months are just a few reasons why risk management is the basic for climate neutrality. If we want to achieve it, production must therefore be predictable, stable, and of course protected. Then step 2 is to preserve biodiversity in orchards. We have a lot of birdhouses, boulders, poles for predators. And what is new on our farm, we are introducing bats and insect houses. Bats are very good alternative to spraying insecticides, as they manage to catch 1,000 or more insects in just one night. And just for example, in America, it is estimated that the bats save farmers up to $53 billion a year from insect predation. So also significant savings in the use of protective equipment. As a third step, I would like to mention the resistant varieties of apples and also other fruits that we have, which with their resistance mean less necessary treatments, which also means less use of tractor crossing, that is lower carbon footprint, less soil loaded, and so on. As you see, there are a lot of small steps. And for sure, one big step already mentioned also by Alan is precision agriculture. On our farm, we have drip irrigation system, which ensures minimal water consumption for the plant's sufficient water needs. We also have special sprayers. I'm not sure how to translate, but an orchard tractor that is smaller and this provides less load on the soil. We also use precision agriculture for fertilizer, but as our farm is not, it's about 20 hectares, sometimes precision agriculture also means that we need to do it by hand because of the lack of mechanization. These were just a few of our steps. However, let me point out that the consumer must also take his step and identify agriculture and give it real value. And I will ask you to go to the next slide, please. As a vice president of CEJA, I can highlight that there are a lot of young farmers all over Europe who are striving in a similar direction on their farms. On the picture, you see some steps are pretty big. Some steps are not even seen, but there are steps. So I want to share with you some short stories. There's young farmer Thomas from Ireland who is changing fertilizer to protected urea, which is one of the big reducing nitrous oxide. Then they are also reducing age at breeding for dairy cows and age at slaughter for methane reduction. They're trying to improve the beef quality of calves from their dairy herd to the latter. There are young farmer Samantha from Italy who is following nature's rhythms. They follow strict organic regulation to grow rice. They start preparing the fields month before planting to neutrality fend over weeds and offer potential obstacles to healthy harvest. There is a lot of young farmers use cover crops and crop rotation to improve soil quality. There is also the wine producer Samuel from France who is putting in winter sheep into the vineyard to ensure reciprocity. So sheep have food and farm has fertilizer vineyards. So as said, there are just some of examples, but there are many, many more around Europe. And we can move to the next slide, please. And I want to conclude by saying that our common step is for each stakeholder. So each of us here today and each of you who are listening this, each of the stakeholder in the value chain that we need to take responsibility and to contribute to common success. So thank you for your attention and help someone with the next step on or you can also do this step by yourself, but don't forget, it's crucial to support young farmers. So I will give the floor back to the moderator. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Doris. Very key what you say there at the end, that these goals can only be accomplished if we work together. And assuredly, there's a whole diversity of farmers in terms of what they farm, their ages, where they're located. And so it's about getting that whole system to work together. So now we're going to move from the farming parts of the whole value chain over to production parts, to more consumer-facing things. I'd like to introduce next Katja Seidenschnur. She's Sustainability Director for Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa at Nestle. So Katja, I turn the floor over to you next.
Thank you very much. So you go to the next slide. So I would like to share with you, first of all, our climate roadmap, and then as well give you a few examples of ongoing projects and why regenerative agriculture is so important for us and why we so strongly believe in it. And then as well give you specific projects on the ground that are happening, which are very promising. And as well, I would like to take the opportunity to raise some challenges that we have, and as well where the European policy can help. So on the next slide, please, you see that I just first wanted to step back to say that it's not just about climate, and as Ellen and also Doris were talking about it, when we look at the planetary boundaries, the 4 priorities for humanity are beyond climate, also the biodiversity, but also halting deforestation and reforesting, and as well the overuse of fertilizers. So this should be our North Star, and this is obviously all interconnected, and we need to look at it holistically, whatever we do, and this is what we are trying to do with our roadmap. When you go to the next slide, we have committed in 2019 and pledged the 1.5 degrees. And as well, 1 year ahead of the deadline last year, we were one of the first signatories to publish a very detailed roadmap that you can find online, so you can dive into that. I also wanted to highlight, next to the targets of -50 and net zero, we've also set a more short-term target for 2025 to reduce carbon emissions by 20%, obviously also including any growth that we have. So compensating for that is scope 3, that's obvious, and also as per science-based target, there is no offsetting, it's all reduction and removals within our own supply chain. And this is where agriculture plays a key role, because it's 70% of our global and also of our European footprint is coming from the ingredients. On the next slide, you see the detailed roadmap, and you cannot read it, and that's not the intention. It's just quite detailed. And two things that I will come back more specifically is we have committed also to source 20% of our key ingredients by 2025 through regenerative agriculture. And as we know that the transition of farmers takes not only time, but also investments, this is where we can play a role. And we have committed to invest 1.1 billion Swiss francs globally to support that transition. And then we will move to 50% of our key ingredients by 2030. The second point is about rebuilding and planting trees. That's within our supply chain. It's not some credit somewhere, but this is together working with our farmers. On the next slide, you can see some specific examples of the end-to-end climate roadmap. So as mentioned, regenerative agriculture, I will dive into that. And this is really the most important one, but we are also decarbonizing further our manufacturing. That has always been a focus. It's only 6% of the footprint, but still it remains important, and that's what we can directly influence and most easily influence ourselves. Also rethinking our logistics, making packaging circular, and then helping through a portfolio shift, moving to more plant-based portfolio, for example, and as well as supporting transparency to the consumer and shopper, which is really crucial to give some guidance and have everyone take the right choice in the store. On the next slide, I just as well wanted to mention that we have just externally published that we want to go beyond sustainability, but rather that's about rebuilding. This is really what the planet needs to protect and restore and rebuild, and that applies for restoring the health of our soils, biodiversity, but also livelihood of farmers in a more inclusive and equal way, and as well, looking at communities and as well a nutritional and balanced diet. Going forward specifically, just to reiterate on the next slide, you see that it's again regenerative agriculture, that's the key, and as well our reforestation program. On the next slide, I wanted to highlight the importance of regenerative agriculture. So the great thing with that is that it doesn't only sequester more carbon, but as well it has an impact on the water quality and the water cycle, biodiversity. After the transition, also from what we have seen and what we know is that the yield should be at least on parity, if not better. The farmers will be more resilient, and as well it will have a positive impact on the nutrients in the soil and hence also in our food. Moving on the next slide, please. So the regenerative agriculture, there's various practices. I will not go into that. I just wanted to share that there's various different applications. So it's different in cocoa and coffee, which is primarily in Latin America or in Asia or in Africa. So there we are looking at, first of all, no deforestation, but also living income and reforesting and restoring, using multiple crops, shade trees in our coffee plantations, etc. Then on milk, we have various initiatives looking at the herd feed, but also manure management, etc. And then working with soils through cover crops, for example, less tillage or moving to organic fertilizer. And then through that as well, it's important to look at the recipes, specifications, and changing our sourcing. If if you look at the next slide, I want to give two specific examples just within Europe that are ongoing. So the first one is called Living Soils in France. This has been ongoing since 2018. And the program, we're working with the farmers, first of all, on training the farmers and accompanying them, guiding them, measuring the improvements, for example, of the soil and the carbon sequestration, but also incentivizing farmers with a price premium. And this one we're going to roll out across France and other countries as well. The second one is quite interesting because it looks at collective financing mechanism. And the idea is a landscape approach where we're trying to aggregate the different projects, the benefits that come from it, not just for carbon, but as well biodiversity, etc. And then whoever has a benefit, municipalities or other manufacturers, can then pitch into the same pot of money, so to say, to pay the farmer. So this is really quite interesting. Sorry. And then on the last slide, please. So these are the challenges and what can help. So, sorry. First of all, I wanted to raise that, first of all, we can get some support and more support in terms of guidance and incentives for farmers. This is really, really key so that the subsidies are directed correctly to the regenerative agricultural practices. And there's 2 points. One is it should go beyond carbon. It should really be looking at the holistic outcomes, so including protection of biodiversity and water. The second point is really that it should not be just a short-term changing 1 year some practices, but this needs to be long-term oriented. And the European funding should ensure that farmers embark on a structural transformation rather than receiving full subsidies for a one-off good agricultural practice, which doesn't really change anything just for 1 year. The second point is really the monitoring, the reporting and verification. Obviously, it depends on the region, etc. It's not that easy. So whatever can help. Also, Alan, you showed some great digital tools. Whatever can help in terms of a measurement and then providing that learning and giving confidence to the farmers, and as well, still making sure that this goes, to the right channel afterwards in terms of reporting and verification. We definitely need to avoid greenwashing, and it's still all about growing food. So we don't want to just have carbon farming market that goes to some offsets for a fossil fuel industry. It really should be embedded as part of the value chain. And then the last point is as well, we need some support and farmers need to become less or no longer reliant on fossil fuel-based fertilizers. So the move to organic fertilizers and reduced pesticides is really important. And linked to that as well, it's important that the advice to the farmers is independent. So if there could be a decoupling of the conditions to buy fertilizers and pesticides and that the farmers get independent advice, this is really key. So I'm really happy that also, Doris, you mentioned the collaboration and the coalition. We only make this work when everyone works together. We are big in one sense, but in the end, we are quite small. There's lots of other manufacturers, and we want to work together. So we are really reaching out to do this together. And I'm really happy to get your support. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, Katja. So I want to just take a moment to put maybe 2 questions from Slido, because we've had a couple come in. Alan, a question for you has come in. What is the role of citizen science in data collection for the environment? Are there geospatial projects that integrate such data already? I think going to the heart of what you were showing there with the slide with the different digital data gathering tools. What is the role of citizen science in that, Alan?
I would say that the potential is fairly unlimited. The role at the moment is there. We actually work with some of those teams now. I don't know if it's appropriate to mention PlantNet and things like that. We're actually working alongside people on harnessing the power of those geotagged photographs. We do it in a formal way in terms of reporting and so on, where you have to be absolutely certain that it's the person that took the photograph in the location at the time specified and all the rest of it. But we are working with more general areas, because I think in the longer term, that will be a key thing. And there is the power now to take a digital photograph and identify a single flower or a butterfly or whatever it happens to be. But we're working on pulling out things like landscape features from photographs and other topics like that. We actually, Yeah, working with citizen science on this. So the answer is we are working with them, and the potential is pretty huge.
Great. So I'm going to hold off the Slido questions. I'm going to put some more to you guys later. But next, I would like to bring in the fourth member of our panel, Pierre Basco. So Pierre is Director for Sustainability and Income Support at the European Commission's Directorate General for Agriculture and Rural Development. So Pierre, I wanted to ask you, the Commission's recently adopted a new climate package with a set of interconnected proposals, as we were talking about in the beginning, and that stretches across different policy areas and economic sectors. And it's specifically to respond to the raised ambition of the 2030 target, so raised to 55%. Fit for 55 needs to get everything more ambitious to get to the more ambitious target. So when it comes to agriculture, and in particular with the land sector, it's proposing climate neutrality by 2035. Is the common agricultural policy fit for purpose to deliver that? Does it have the right tools to help the farming sector play its roles in delivering that goal, Pierre?
Thank you, Dave. Thank you for your question, and this is these are two very important questions. The proposed climate neutrality for the land sector highlights that land managers, and I would say including farmers and foresters, will have an important role to play both for reducing emissions and also for increasing the EU sink, and several practices and technologies to increase the sink and for reducing emissions are already available, and for some of them they are quite well known, and Christian in his opening has already mentioned a few of them. But critically, I think the common agricultural policy, and in particular, I think the future policy framework for the CAP, will clearly be an essential tool for promoting and supporting the uptake of these practices and technologies by farmers, in particular, when this uptake entails, I think, specific needs related to the covering of cost, I think, of conversion, needs related to the cost, I think, of maintenance, other needs, and these have been raised, I think, by two previous speakers, needs in terms of guidance and advices about how to change practice, production system. So how do we intend, I think, to do that? First of all, I think we've reinforced policy toolbox or financial incentive in support of sustainable and climate-friendly practices. This concerns in particular the new eco schemes that will provide significant support for farmers choosing climate-friendly farming practices. And as an example, I think earlier this year the Commission published an indicative list of agricultural practices that could benefit, I think, from support under the eco scheme, and they include, for instance, agroforestry, conservation agriculture, winter soil cover and catch crop, rewetting wetlands and peatlands, and other types of practices which are part of agroecology. And all these practices, and I would say production systems, have and will have a direct contribution to climate objectives. This concerns also the more traditional rural development intervention in what we call, I think, the second pillar of the CAP, that can support not only specific farming practices and production system, but also productive and non-productive investment support, advisory services, training, and cooperation approaches. And through the European Innovation Partnership, in particular for agricultural productivity and sustainability, land managers will also be able to cooperate and test new approaches for the co-creation and dissemination of solutions which are really ready to be implemented, I think, in practice. And in the future, the climate impact, I think, of all these different types of practices and production system will be strengthened by the introduction of a new and, in our view, more effective delivery mechanism of public support, which is offering more flexibility for the member states to better take account of local conditions and needs and specificities, but also a new delivery model, ensuring greater policy coherence with environmental and climate legislation. And under the future CAP, under the future Common Agricultural Policy, in the strategic plan, member states will have the legal obligation to show greater ambition than at present with regard, I think, to the care for climate. And this has been clearly reflected in the recommendation that the Commission has addressed, I think, to the member states for the alignment of the strategic plan, I think, for the future CAP with the Green Deal objectives. And in this recommendation, the Commission highlighted and underlined, I think, the measures that look the most promising to achieve climate mitigation in each member state. To recall also that in financial terms, member states within the future CAP will have to spend at least 25% of the overall envelope available for direct payment, so a very significant amount of money, and this for the eco scheme. And they will have also to spend at least 35% of the rural development funds, I think the second pillar, for measures supporting climate, for measures supporting biodiversity, environment, and animal welfare. And overall, the CAP, 40% of the CAP budget is expected over the period 2023-2027 to contribute to climate-related objectives. So a very significant contribution and support, I think, from the CAP for climate-friendly practices, but I would say more generally for ensuring the transition towards sustainability, resilience, and competitiveness. And I would like to finish by this. Beyond, I think, the CAP, there can be new business opportunities for farmers and for foresters, and this has already been introduced by Christian in the plenary when talking about, I think, the carbon farming. The Commission is working on a communication which is planned, I think, for the next few days, with a view to promote the setting of schemes rewarding carbon sequestration by farmers and by foresters, and to upscale them across, I think, the whole EU, with the support, I think, of the CAP and other types of public funding, but also with the support, I think, of the private sector. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Pierre. I think it's interesting what you say, that this isn't just about CAP obligations, but we're talking about real business opportunities for farmers here. Katja, I wanted to go back to you and ask again, as I mentioned, you're a consumer-facing, Nestle is a consumer-facing company. So when we're talking about whether or not climate efforts are recognized by the society as a whole, and whether or not consumers really see value in a company taking these types of measures, particularly when it comes to agricultural sourcing, where they source their goods, which isn't always necessarily visible to a consumer, right? What are the advantages for a company of having a climate neutral supply chain? And how do you think consumers generally, your consumers specifically, are valorizing it? And finally, is there something that we could do in terms of policy to make consumers more aware of when their products have been sourced from more sustainable farming?
Thank you. Those are lots of questions. So I'll try to be sharp and answer them. I would say, first of all, we can see that the consumer has an increased awareness about climate and the environmental problems. But generally, I would say, and especially after COVID as well, focus more on health and the importance, and that our supply chain is fragile, etc. So there are some question marks, and obviously also with COP26, there's been a lot of communication around climate. But overall, I would say there are still a lot of challenges in terms of knowledge. And this is where education is really key. So, for example, biodiversity or the importance of agriculture. I think these are topics that are not that mainstream known, maybe to some specific, very, very interested consumers, but it's at the moment rather niche. And I think the second point is as well that I think when you go into a store as a consumer or as a shopper, it's really difficult for them to choose what's actually right. I mean, even if there was the willingness to choose the right product, it's very difficult to differentiate one product from another. I think maybe with the exception of bio or organic, which is quite known, the rest, regenerative agriculture, obviously, that's not very, very well known yet. So this is where I think for me comes the first point into place, how important education is to the consumer and to the shopper, be it from the manufacturer, be it, but as well, in schools or through media, to focus on, first of all, the issues, but as well on the solutions and what are the right choices and the right questions to ask. The other one is as well, in terms of the manufacturers. I think the consumer might be willing to pay some price premium for some products, but not generally. I think the consumer generally is expecting that this, will be covered by the manufacturer, by the whole supply chain. And I think this is really the importance as well for manufacturers to recognize actually it's the responsibility of us. And no matter what the consumer thinks and no matter what the consumer knows or not, we know more and we know where are the issues and we know what we need to do. So I consider it really, and Nestle considers that as a business responsibility. This is why we need to act, not because the consumer knows it or doesn't know it. And then with that as well, try to educate the consumer. But I do think the pressure will increase for sure. And in that sense, when I think from a business opportunity perspective, the sooner we act and the faster we act, the better it will be to provide food and the resilience that we all need. But as well, there will be business opportunities due to regulations, due to investors' pressure, and also due to rising consumer awareness and also rising consumer pressure. So definitely this is there. Yes, in terms of the last question you talked about the policy. Yes, for sure, policy can help exactly in these areas as well. So first of all, in terms of obviously agricultural policies, but also building infrastructure. If I think about, logistics, if I think about, renewable energy, if I think about infrastructure for packaging, that's another problem which we're not covering really here, but we need to have the recycling rates generally are super low, and we can change our materials, but if the infrastructure isn't there, we don't really change anything. So that's another point. So that can help. Regulation can help. Carbon taxes, if they are, well and standardized and well done. So the right incentives and subsidies. Helping the system collaboration as well. And the last point, coming back to the consumer piece, helping the transparency. So transparency in terms of end-to-end supply chain transparency, what's happening on the farm, which agricultural practices were used on the farm, and then giving that transparency end-to-end up to the consumer in a easy way somehow through a standardized and a fair system that gives the transparency to the consumer so that we empower the consumer to make the right choices and reward the ones that are supporting the true and genuine and honest transformation of the food system. Not some greenwashing, not some, buying credits for something, but really changing end-to-end the food system, and that should be rewarded. And there, this transparency can really drive the whole change throughout, every citizen in Europe.
Doris, a question for you. So, switching to a whole new farming system, which is what we've been talking about here, it's a big challenge. It's expensive, it's a lot of work. So what do you think is necessary to convince land managers to do this? What's the best narrative to convince them that this is a good idea to embrace climate neutral farming, both for the climate, the planet as a whole, but also for their own bottom line?
As a young farmer, I can tell you that we are already convinced by the necessity to adopt climate neutral management practices. For example, this year, we lost on our farm a significant share of production due to the frost. It was more than 85%, and we are for sure not isolated case. So the frequency and intensity of these events lead us to reflect new ways in which to contribute to the fight against climate change, rather than fighting climate actions. And when reflecting, there are some variables that simply need to be taken into account because they are at the core of entrepreneurship, agripreneurship, if you want. So the economic situation of farm, capacity for investment, availability of workforce, the extent to which your current knowledge and skills are enough. So there are a lot of things that we need today, but it's very important that it's to be acknowledged as a part of the solution. So rather than being pointed at and to be accompanied with robust policy and market tools. But I want also add that it was mentioned transparency, which is crucial also for us, for young farmers. if I just say that it begins from the farm, and it's not just transparency on the farm, but through whole value chain. And maybe just the last thing, it's very important that we have broad toolbox. It was also mentioned, and also that there is access to land to young farmers, because without agricultural land, there is no climate neutrality. It is our primary resource as farmers. It is also one of our primary tools in the achievements of climate neutrality. So as such, it needs to be further protected. So yeah, for young farmers, it's crucial, this toolbox, of course, all other resources, and everything needs to be not just affordable, but also accessible for young farmers.
Yeah, that's a good point, and it's a good segue actually to my next question for Alan. So Alan, in your presentation, you told us about the pressure that climate change and increasing extreme weather events is imposing on agricultural and forestry ecosystems. So in the view of that, and in the view of ensuring that land managers can contribute to climate neutrality in a fair way, what are the actions that both policymakers and land managers need to take right away, right now?
Ooh, okay. The fair bit in your question, I think, is the first point, and that's right back to Doris and what her answer was. Whatever we do, it shouldn't be a loss maker. So whatever we put in place, we've got to maintain the livelihood of our land managers. What should policymakers do tomorrow? Depends which policymaker you're talking to. I think a lot of policymakers are actually doing things right now. And we're in a critical moment with the member states preparing their CAP strategic plans, and they need to be ambitious enough. The Commission, not just Pierre, but across the board, is preparing legislation and measures that really are realistic and ambitious as well. And they need to put in place benchmarking and I don't like to use the word monitoring because it's a bit loaded as a term, but systems that will allow us to check on progress not tomorrow, but the day after tomorrow, when the policy is in place tomorrow. And then for the land manager, well, the land manager could take action tomorrow by doing things like planting along the contour and putting in grassland margins and bidding in grass soil conservation terracing to protect against the increases in soil erosion with increased heavy rainfall events. The land manager tomorrow could be planting more trees. The land manager tomorrow could be using biochar. But what the land manager tomorrow really probably should be doing is making sure, and I think Doris was very much on this line, is use the agricultural knowledge information systems and start making sure that those decisions are informed. And that there's also a missing one from that is what should the scientists be doing as well? And we should be making sure that that information flow is packaged properly and make sure that it gets into the hands of the land manager and the policymaker and even the commercial world of Nestle as well in a digestible and realistic form. So that's the action for tomorrow.
Great. So let's take some more questions that have come in from Slido. So Katya, I have a question for you. And this is on regenerative agriculture. And this is something I've heard quite a lot about regenerative agriculture. It's something a lot of people ask. So this question is from Paul. Katya, why are you pushing the narrative of regenerative agriculture in Europe when these are simply good agricultural practices for EU farmers? Won't that just confuse people? So when you're talking about regenerative agriculture, is it really a separate type of farming, or are we really just talking about best practices?
So great question. Maybe I would want to pass the question on to Doris. But generally what we see, if we would be asking our procurement division to source regenerative agriculture or the practices that have regenerative agricultural practices, I don't think there would be that much supply. So I'm not sure, I don't have numbers, maybe Alain can help me or Pierre, on how much of these good practices are really on the market, but we don't really see that that heavily. What we see is the intense agriculture, and also we know that we have these planetary boundary issues also in Europe. So the solution isn't there. Otherwise, we would just buy it. And this is where that's why we are engaging with farmers. And yes, you can call it good old farming practices, depending on maybe going back to when. But these are the practices, just to be clear on, these are the practices that we would wish and that we know they have a positive benefit. And this is why we're looking at those specific practices. So if there's a hidden market somewhere that everyone is doing these practices, I would be happy, because that would make our lives much easier. But I don't think that's really there. I can't quantify it, but I think it's not really common good practice at the moment.
Yeah, I'm not aware of that either. But Doris, we'll go to Katja's suggestion to go to you. I mean, do you think, in terms of the framing here, given that a lot of these good practices aren't widespread, is it more helpful to frame this as a new, exciting type of agriculture, regenerative agriculture, or frame this as, this is what you should have been doing all along, it's never too late to start, go start doing this now?
Yes, for sure, it's never too late to start. Martin Luther King said, there is always right time to do what is right. But I want to point out once again, there are already good practices, agriculture practices all over the Europe. So it's very important that we share them more through not so good practices, because leading with examples, I think that's the crucial here. But we need to take into account, because we have very diverse farming sector, agriculture sector in Europe. Also, young farmers is the same. We have from small farms to big farms, from very technological farms to the farms who are doing mainly everything by hand, from organic production to other types of production. And it's very important that we are. And I'm sure that in Europe, we have very good agriculture sector, but we need to protect it. We need to enable farmer to get with the farming, with the agriculture, the price that will enable him decent life. And I think when the farmers will have this, we will go further to the climate neutral farming, because as it was said many times before today, first we need resilient farms, developed farms, sustainable farms. And I mean here sustainability in all three terms, not just in this nature term, but also economic and social. And then I think the farming neutral system is here for us.
Alan, Katja had asked that maybe you had figures on regenerative agriculture. Do you, by any chance?
Yes, I got one or two. There's about 65 million hectares of our farmland classified as high nature value already. And we've got about 8% of the total agricultural area is already under organic farming. So I think that, things are moving in the right direction. I would soundly agree with what Doris said, that there is a strong move. So I'll give you those two numbers because I'm pretty confident of those two. 12.98 million hectares under organic farming in 2018 and 64 million hectares of high nature value farmland. So those are two numbers.
Okay. Katja, another question to you. Katja, is a question from Paul. Will you really pay more for sustainable climate neutral farming practices, or just rely on the EU to pay via cap mechanisms? I think that goes to the larger question of how much government support is needed to make this transition.
So we are committed no matter what. So the money that I was mentioning this is what we have estimated, what is needed in order to reach our commitments of the 20% regenerative agricultural volume of key ingredients by 2025. That's what we have estimated in terms of various financing mechanisms. So this is our investment. And then if obviously with the new policies coming in, it would be great to have European Union support. But this is what we are investing. So that's coming from the Nestle P&L.
Pierre, I'll put the same question to you. How much EU support is going to be needed here financially versus how much the companies need to pay for it themselves?
Well, I think at EU level, I think as I said, I think the CAP will be the key public policy that will promote and support, I think, financially, I think, the farmers into this transformation. And if I may rebound, I think, on the previous question, what is important, I think, to underline is that we should all go into this transition towards sustainability, climate neutrality, and resilience. And we should build, I think, on the effort which have already been achieved, I think, until now. There is a very strong, changes and transformation, I think, of the farm sector, on which I think we need to accelerate and that we need to upscale. It is clear that we still a long way to go, but we know a lot, I think, about all of the different types of practices, all the different types of production system, which may be more appropriate or less appropriate, I think, to farmers, depending on the pedoclimatic condition, I think, in which they work, I think, depending on the socioeconomic, structure, I think, of the farm, also, I think, the type of sector in which, I think, these farmers have invested. But clearly, I think, the CAP will be there to support, I think, the farmers to upscale, I think, this transition toward, I think, very large numbers, because I think what we want is by 2030 to make sure that, I think, almost all farmers, and I would say, let's be optimistic, all farmers will undertake and will achieve, I think, this sustainability, this resilience, and also competitiveness, because we shouldn't forget that agriculture is an economic sector. And for this, as I said, we provide financial support with significant amount of money under both pillars, I think the first and second pillar of the CAP. But in my view, what is key also is to better accompany farmers with advice, with training, with knowledge exchange, etc., so that farmers are not left on their own, I think, having to adapt, I think, to this new condition. But I think they are combined, I think, by research, innovation, and all this knowledge transfer, which is so badly needed, so that by 2030, when we will look, I think, at the performance, the environmental, climate, but also economic performance, I think, of the farm sector, we will have a sector which is much more resilient and which is much more viable than as it is now over the medium term.
Thanks. So I'll take one more question before we wrap up, and I think it's a good forward-looking question for Doris from Slido. Are young farmers, Doris, more open to climate-neutral farming than older farmers?
Yes, I'm sure that that's the only answer. Yes, because everyone know, not just young farmers, I can also say that all farmers know that like nature environment is here for us. We are doing it with environment every day. So it's very important that we not just benefit, but also put something to the nature back. So yes.
I suspected that would be the answer. Well, thank you to all of our panelists for some really great insights. I mean, I think what we've heard here today is that the need for climate neutral farming is more important than ever, both for mitigation and for adaptation, because on one hand, farming practices need to change to meet the EU's more ambitious targets for 2030 and net neutrality by 2050. At the same time, as Alan showed us, climate patterns are changing and farmers are going to have to adjust going forward and adapt to the new changing weather patterns. So thank you so much to all of our panelists. Thanks to you at home for following along. So you're now going to want to go to session 5, the reporting part. So you want to back up out of this session and go to the main session, where I will join you there along with the other moderators from the breakout sessions, and we'll be going through a summary of what we all just discussed. So if you want to hear about what happened in the other workshops that were happening at the same time as ours, tune into that. Just go back out to session 5 report. I'll see you there.